Welcome to The Debate. Normally, when you think about looking into a mirror, there is this fundamental unspoken expectation of physical reality. You stand in front of the glass, you raise your right hand, and, the reflection raises its left hand. It is entirely passive.
Right, it's just basic physics. I mean, the glass is just bouncing light back at you.
Exactly. It's passive and it's objective. But when you step into the world of severe personality disorders, specifically when we examine the psychological phenomenon known as mirroring, that glass shatters. We are suddenly looking at a reflection that isn't passive at all. It is highly active, it is incredibly complex, and honestly, it can be deeply destructive to the person standing on the other side of it.
Because it is the absolute definition of a psychological distortion. The reflection you see in that dynamic, it isn't really you and it isn't really them. It's rather this manufactured hybrid that serves a very specific and often desperate function in the relationship.
Yeah, and today we are exploring the chameleon effect, or pathological mirroring, and we're primarily looking at this within the context of covert narcissism and borderline personality disorder. We are dissecting those intense relationships where one partner entirely adopts the traits, beliefs, and behaviors of the other, only to eventually, completely shatter that shared identity.
And the central tension we are untangling here is the underlying mechanism and the true intent behind this behavior.
Right. So the core question we are debating is this. Is pathological mirroring fundamentally a calculated, manipulative tactic used for emotional exploitation and control, or is it an unconscious, desperate survival mechanism rooted in profound neurobiological deficits and a literal lack of identity? I take the position that, regardless of the internal psychological landscape of the perpetrator, mirroring, especially in covert presentations, operates as an active, weaponized system of psychological extraction.
And I look at the clinical reality and see something far more tragic. I argue that framing this behavior strictly as calculated, Machiavellian manipulation, completely obscures what is actually happening on the brain. Mirroring is primarily a trauma-driven adaptation to a profoundly empty core.
Well, let's start with how this actually plays out in the real world. Because as a profiler, I look at the behavior. Usually, this happens right at the beginning of the relationship during that intense love bombing phase. But with covert narcissists, it doesn't look like grandiosity. It looks shy. It looks introverted.
Right, it's the "we're two broken souls" narrative.
Exactly. It's this depressed persona. When you break down the behavior, mirroring is inherently an extractive process. The individual is intensely studying their target. And I don't just mean noticing what kind of music they like. They are gathering deep data on the target's vulnerabilities, their core values, and, critically, their past traumas.
They essentially become a perfect emotional twin.
Yes, exactly. And they reflect it all back for a very specific reason: to hijack the victim's dopamine reward system. It's not an accident. It establishes this overwhelming false sense of compatibility. The victim feels they have finally found their soulmate, someone who truly gets them. But what's really happening is a rapid dismantling of the victim's personal boundaries to secure a reliable source of narcissistic supply.
Let's unpack that term, though, because narcissistic supply sounds like a vampire draining blood. It implies a very conscious, villainous intent.
Well, it is a form of emotional extraction. These individuals often cannot regulate their own self-esteem internally. They need a constant external stream of validation, attention, and control to feel stable. Mirroring is the precision tool they wield to gain power over another human being's reality, ensuring that supply never dries up.
I completely disagree with the premise that it's wielded with that kind of conscious precision, though. Especially when we look at severe identity disturbance, which is a hallmark of borderline personality disorder and even vulnerable narcissism. To understand this, you really have to look at the late psychoanalyst James Grotstein's concept of the black hole at the core of the borderline patient.
The idea that there is just nothing there?
Literally, nothing. No internal anchor. No stable autobiographical narrative from one day to the next. So their chameleon effect isn't some master strategy for interpersonal dominance. Think about it. If you have no idea who you are, you have zero confidence that your true self, which just feels like a terrifying void, will be acceptable to anyone.
Right. So they borrow one?
Aren't accepted, you risk abandonment. And to someone with severe identity disturbance, abandonment doesn't just mean being sad or lonely. It is synonymous with psychological annihilation.
So you're arguing the mirroring is just them trying to exist in the presence of someone else.
It is an unconscious survival strategy. Yes, being left alone with a self that doesn't exist is utterly terrifying. They mirror because they are adapting to avoid, not because they are executing a masterclass in manipulation.
Okay, but if we are honest about the mechanics of how this mirroring is deployed, the unconscious survival defense starts to fall apart. Think about the sheer, uncanny precision of the chameleon effect in a covert narcissist. This isn't just someone nodding along to be polite at a dinner party.
No, it's much deeper.
Right. This is a partner who adopts your exact political talking points, almost word for word, who suddenly claims your obscure favorite indie bands is the soundtrack to their life, who even mirrors your physical micro-expressions.
It's absolute fusion.
Yes, fusion, but let's look at how they achieve it. I think of it like a computer hacker. A hacker doesn't just smash a keyboard and hope they get into a mainframe. They probe the system. They send out tiny requests to see which ports are open and which firewalls are weak. During the idealization phase, the mirroring individual is actively probing the target's psychological system.
Wait, I have to stop you there, because the hacker analogy is exactly where we fundamentally diverge.
Hear me out for a second, though. If they probe and find a vulnerability, let's say they discover you have a deep-seated fear of professional failure or maybe a complex about your physical appearance, they catalog it. They don't use it right away. They store it. And we know they store it because months or years later, during the devaluation phase, that exact vulnerability is weaponized against you.
I know, the micro-insults.
Exactly. The subtle, plausible deniability of covert gaslighting. You simply cannot execute that kind of delayed, targeted emotional damage without premeditation. That requires an architecture of manipulation.
I see why that sequence of events looks like a hack from the outside. I really do. But here's why the hacker analogy completely misrepresents the pathology. A hacker has a distinct, stable identity outside of the system they are infiltrating, right? They are sitting in a chair, drinking a coffee, entirely separate from the code they're writing.
Sure, they are an independent agent, but the individuals we are talking about, especially adults with severe identity disturbance, do not have that separate, stable self to retreat to. The neurological reality is that for many of these people, their brain learned in early childhood that being authentic was literally dangerous. It resulted in abuse or severe neglect. So the neural pathways for self-reflection, for generating their own internal values, they never fully developed.
So how does that explain the exact replication of the partner's traits then? If they aren't hacking the system, what are they doing? They are borrowing an identity prosthetic just to be able to walk around in the world. When they adopt your coffee order or your political views, they aren't trying to steal your data. They are trying on an exoskeleton. If you stop a severely borderline or vulnerable individual and ask them, no, really, what do you want for your own birthday? What are your actual values? They freeze.
Because they don't know the answer.
Because the answer isn't hidden. It genuinely doesn't exist. To call that premeditated manipulation assigns a level of cognitive organization and long-term plotting that they simply do not possess in that moment.
Okay, well, let's step away from the analogies and look straight at the neurobiology then, because I think the brain imaging actually proves the extractive nature of this behavior. Let's look at the structural anomalies we see in the right anterior insula.
Right, the salience network.
Exactly. For those listening, the right anterior insula is essentially the brain's switchboard for empathy. It's the region responsible for shifting your attention away from your own internal state and focusing on the emotional reality of someone else. But in narcissistic populations, we see decreased deactivation in this region during empathy tasks, meaning they are trapped in a state of hyper-self-focus. They literally cannot turn off the me channel.
Which perfectly supports the idea that they are trapped in their own deficit.
But wait, they don't just sit there in isolated self-focus. They engage in what's known as selective empathy. And this is where it gets incredibly manipulative, especially with covert narcissism. Wait, look at how they use pity. They present these highly tailored, deeply moving exhibitions of victimhood. They know exactly what emotional strings to pull to overstimulate your mirror neuron system.
They make you feel their pain.
They force you to internalize their distress. That's not depression. That's weaponized guilt. They use the silent treatment or weaponized incompetence to make you feel like you are failing them, and it creates this traumatic neural loop in the victim's brain. The victim's cortisol spikes, massive anxiety because they can't sue the narcissist, followed by a hit of dopamine when they finally manage to pacify them.
It's exhausting for the partner, absolutely.
It is a literal neurobiological hijacking. The mirrorer is using the victim's own empathy to extract emotional labor and regulate their own nervous system. Whether their insula is structurally anomalous or not, the mechanism is parasitic.
That is a fascinating way to frame it, but you are isolating one part of the brain and ignoring the broader neurobiological profile. If we look at the whole picture, the brain imaging heavily reinforces the survival theory. We have to talk about the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex, the MPFC.
The fear center and the reasoning center.
Right. These individuals often have a hyperreactive amygdala. They are exquisitely hypersensitive to ego threats. A slight shift in your tone of voice, a totally neutral facial expression, their amygdala flags it as a mortal threat. They're living in a constant state of hyperarousal. And what happens when the amygdala is hijacked by panic? The MPFC, the part of the brain responsible for cognitive perspective-taking, moral reasoning, seeing others as separate humans, it hypoactivates. It essentially powers down.
So you're saying they literally lose the biological capacity to empathize in that moment.
Yes. They are trapped in a biological state of self-defense. Think of it less like a calculated computer hack and more like a blown fuse in a building's electrical grid. When the survival alarms start blaring, all the higher-level functions, the lights, the elevators, the moral reasoning, go completely dark. Only the emergency sprinklers are left on.
But the damage...
They pull you into that chaos not because they are evil masterminds, but because their nervous system believes they are facing annihilation. They physically cannot process you as a separate human being with your own needs because they are entirely consumed by managing their own internal system failure.
Look, I understand the blown fuse analogy. I really do. But if you were listening to this and you have been on the receiving end of this covert mirroring, hearing it described as an involuntary system failure probably feels like a massive cop-out.
Oh, it's incredibly hard to hear when you're the one who got burned. I see that in therapy all the time.
Exactly, because it completely ignores how these cycles actually culminate. If this were purely an involuntary panic response, we wouldn't see the specific, highly destructive and often cruel ways these relationships end in the discard phase. Look at the mechanics of the discard. The psychology outlines very clearly how the narcissist views the partner. Once the mirroring has secured you, your actual independence becomes a threat. So what do? They attempt to convert you into an inanimate, internalized snapshot. It's the concept of the Egyptian mummy.
This is a really crucial conceptualization to understand.
Yes, and how does a living, breathing partner actually get converted into a mummy? The narcissist basically takes a mental photograph of you at your most compliant, your most mirrored state. And from then on, they interact with that photograph in their mind, not the real you. But eventually, because you are a human being, you deviate from the snapshot. You have a bad day. You assert a boundary. You change your mind.
You break the illusion of perfection.
Right. And when you break the illusion, the covert narcissist devalues and discards you. And this is exactly what trips victims up. They engage in a retroactive rewriting of history. Suddenly, they claim they were faking it the whole time. They openly mock the very shared interest they previously mirrored so perfectly.
They completely erase the shared reality.
It is profound gaslighting. It completely destabilizes the victim's reality. The victim is left holding the bag for a deeply intimate shared life that the mirrorer now claims never even existed. When you actively destroy another person's perception of reality just to preserve your own false self, you are engaging in targeted abuse. The internal chaos of the perpetrator does not excuse the sheer destructiveness of the execution.
I want to be very, very clear here. I agree that the impact on the victim is devastating, and it absolutely falls under the category of psychological abuse. But we have to draw a sharp clinical distinction here between the narcissistic discard you just described and the borderline discard, because they illustrate fundamentally different intents.
How so? I mean, the result is exactly the same. The victim is discarded and shattered.
The result is the same, yes, but the mechanism driving it is opposite. The narcissist, as you said, is threatened by your presence. Your autonomy threatens their superiority, so they want to separate. They mummify you to freeze you in place so they can exist independently. But the borderline individual is terrified of your absence.
Because of that core abandonment terror.
Exactly. So they mirror and merge with you to avoid being left alone. But here is the tragic paradox of severe identity disturbance. Complete fusion inevitably triggers the exact opposite terror, engulfment anxiety.
Meaning they feel suffocated by the very closeness they demanded.
Yes. As they merge with you, they feel like they are being swallowed alive, like they are losing whatever fragmented, tiny sense of self they have left. So the sudden, cruel discard from a borderline partner isn't a calculated execution or a cold deletion of a snapshot. It's a panic response to engulfment. They push you away simply as a reflex to stop their own feeling of suffocation.
It's an involuntary repetition compulsion.
Precisely. It's a torturous approach avoidance cycle. They devalue you to reduce their own terror, and once the anxiety subsides and they feel lonely again, they will often try to pull you back in. The machinery behind the scenes is entirely different.
But does that mechanical distinction actually change the reality of the behavior? Whether the mirroring stops because a narcissist has finished embalming your identity, or because a borderline individual is panicking over engulfment, the behavioral manifestation operates as a systematic manipulation. And I think this brings us squarely to the both-and framework that is so prevalent in modern clinical psychology.
It really is the only way to look at this without losing the humanity on either side.
Right, and I think this is where we have to reconcile these two realities. Yes, we can acknowledge the neurobiological deficits. We can understand that this person is terrified, unanchored, and using the victim as a temporary identity prosthetic just to survive the day.
That is the necessary empathy piece.
It is. And simultaneously, we must rigorously identify that the method they use to manage that deficit, securing attachment through deceitful mirroring, hijacking empathy through pity, and then discarding the victim when the illusion cracks, operates as a systematic destruction of the victim's reality. We can have profound compassion for the void, but we have to call the behavior what it is. It's manipulative and it's abusive.
I don't disagree with the both-and framework regarding the impact on the victim, the somatic toll, the chronic cortisol spikes, the walking on eggshells every single day, the total loss of trust in their own judgment. That is undeniably real, and it destroys lives. But I maintain that slapping the label of calculated manipulation on severe identity disturbance minimizes the absolute tragedy of that black hole.
Because manipulation inherently implies a conscious leverage of power.
Exactly. And the mirroring we see here is a desperate attempt to reflect a self that was never allowed to form in the first place. It is a heartbreaking failure of neurodevelopment. The real tragedy is that the very survival mechanism they use to stave off the terror of being alone is exactly what destroys the genuine human connection they literally rely on to exist. They are psychologically starving, and their only way to eat is to consume the relationship itself.
It seems the tension between intent, whether it's an unconscious survival reflex or a strategy of conquest, and impact, which is undeniably abusive, remains incredibly difficult to untangle. Looking at personality disorders requires us to hold two opposing truths at once: the perpetrator's biological reality and the victim's psychological toll.
It challenges us to sit with the extreme discomfort that human behavior can be simultaneously deeply wounded and deeply wounding.
Which leaves us with a lingering question. When you stand in front of that psychological mirror and the reflection looking back at you is actually someone else borrowing your identity just to survive their own emptiness, when the glass finally breaks, who is left standing in the room? Thank you for joining us on The Debate.